One area that the Soviet Union seemed to excel at during the alternate Second World War against the Allies were their armored vehicles. Thanks to their industrial might, the Union could send a seemingly limitless number of tanks against the Allies. Heavy tanks were by far the most common type. Despite their slower movement speed, heavy tanks were built with greater firepower in mind, being armed with twin 105mm cannons. While its armor was roughly the same as that of the Allies' medium tanks, the extra cannon on the heavy tank enabled it to fire a follow-up shot, one that could finish off the opposing Allied tank before it fired or reloaded its own weapon. But the heavy tank itself did have a longer reload time, which didn't help when outnumbered. Stalin wasn't satisfied with the heavy tanks being able to simply go toe-to-toe with Allied medium tanks, and approved the creation of a larger, more powerful tank, one that could represent the true might of the Soviet Union. The result of this project was the largest land-based weapons platform at the time, the Mammoth tank. Like the heavy tank, the Mammoth was armed with two cannons, but these were 120mm cannons compared to the Heavy's 105mm. In addition, the Mammoth tank was armed with a couple of missile pods, attached to each side of the tank's turret. These missiles were the Soviets' attempt at providing the tank a defense mechanism against the Allies' longbow attack helicopters, which proved effective against Soviet ground vehicles. These missiles proved highly effective against enemy infantry as well. Outfitted with quad treads instead of two continuous tracks, the Mammoth was one of the slowest moving tanks in the Soviet arsenal. The Mammoth made up for this weakness by having the thickest armor of any tank at that time, enabling it to absorb a lot of damage before meeting its end. Ideally, this meant the Allies would have to expend a substantial amount of man, material, and firepower just to destroy a single Mammoth. Another aspect that contributed to the Mammoth's survivability was the addition of an engineer among its crew. This engineer would repair any damage the tank sustained, allowing it to remain on the front lines instead of having to fall back to a service depot. More critical damage couldn't be repaired by an engineer's basic toolkit, in which case, it was imperative for the Mammoth tank to use a service depot. When it was first introduced in the war, the Mammoth tank proved to be a mighty and intimidating sight on the battlefield. However, using newly advanced technology created by Albert Einstein, alongside receiving greater financial, material, and military support from the United States, the Allies were better able to exploit the weaknesses in the Soviets' arsenal, turning the course of the war in their favor. The Soviet Union's own scientists rushed to come up with ways to counter the Allies, one of which was to make improvements to their existing arsenal of Mammoth tanks. With the help of one Dr. Dmitri, the Soviets created a new super tank based on the original Mammoth design. These super tanks featured near impenetrable armor, more powerful cannons, and were equipped with their own mobile Iron Curtain generator, which, when activated, made them invulnerable to any physical damage. These super tanks also required no crewmen, being fully automated, and had a secondary machine gun to deal with infantry close to the vehicle. Dr. Dmitri did not wish to continue developing these monstrosities for the Soviets, though, and requested assistance from the Allies to defect. The super tanks were undergoing tests at a facility in Poland, but something had gone wrong, as the tanks went haywire, attacking anyone in their path, including Allies, Soviets, and civilians. Thanks to an Allied spy that infiltrated a Soviet radar center, he was able to reprogram the super tanks, making Soviet forces their exclusive targets. As the super tanks rampaged through the nearby Soviet base, the Allies linked up with Dr. Dmitri, evacuating him from the area. The super tanks went on to destroy the rest of the Soviet base, before detonating in a large explosion, proving just how destructive these tanks could have been if the Soviets managed to manufacture them in significant numbers. As the Allies continued to make advances, the Soviet Union became more and more desperate to stop them. Some Soviet scientists and generals saw the writing on the wall, that defeat for the Union was inevitable. In that case, they would take as much of the Allies down with them as they could, leading to the development of a, quote, final solution weapon called the MAD tank. MAD being an acronym for Mutually Assured Destruction. The MAD tank was based on the chassis of the Mammoth tank. This was perhaps due to the Soviets having limited resources in the later stages of the war. Instead of a turret, the tank had an armored cabin where the operator drove and activated the tank's weapon system. This weapon was located behind the cabin, taking the form of a large metallic cylinder. This weapon made the Mad Tank slightly slower moving than the Mammoth, despite its lack of armor, but if successfully deployed, it could be the most destructive unit on the battlefield. Immediately after activating the weapon, the operator would jump out of the tank. The large cylinder at the back would begin charging up its attack. Once fully charged, the weapon detonates, destroying the tank itself and sending a powerful seismic shockwave outward in all directions. This shockwave damages any structures or vehicles within its wide radius, and did not discriminate between friend or foe. Infantry units were the only ones that were unaffected by this shockwave. Once activated, the only way to stop a Mad Tank from detonating was to destroy it, neutralizing its destructive effect.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
While a serious threat, a single Mad Tank could be astutely dealt with, whether by eliminating it before detonation, or quickly repairing any damage sustained in its aftermath. However, multiple Mad Tanks rolling up near an Allied base and detonating at the same time could cause catastrophic destruction, bringing all structures crumbling to the ground. The Allies first learned about the Mad Tank during their campaign against the Soviets in Poland. Knowing they needed to halt the development of this weapon, the Allies tasked an unnamed commander to handle the mission. There was already an Allied base established in the region where the Soviets conducted tests of the Mad Tank. The Allied commander didn't know the exact location of the remote control station for the Mad Tanks, and so sent out spies to infiltrate 3 Soviet intel centers to pinpoint the station's location. While the spies did their work, the Soviets actively performed tests with the Mad Tanks, their detonations damaging the Allied commander's base and units. The Allied commander couldn't attack the Mad Tanks directly, as they were well protected by Mammoth tanks, which in turn were protected by an Iron Curtain. This Iron Curtain would activate whenever a Mad Tank was deployed, protecting any vehicle or structure within its shroud from taking damage. This made the Iron Curtain a priority target for the commander to destroy when given the opportunity. After the spies had successfully infiltrated all 3 intel centers, the Allied commander now knew the location of the control station, it being on a small island well away from the test site. Using newly developed chrono tanks, the Allied commander was able to destroy this remote control station, halting the production of any new Mad Tanks. Afterwards, the Allied commander ordered his forces to destroy the Iron Curtain and the rest of the Soviet research complex, completing the mission. Though this facility had been destroyed, Allied commanders in other theaters could have still encountered Soviet Mad Tanks, though not in great enough numbers to impact the course of the war. With Stalin's death, the Second World War had finally come to an end. Instead of being disbanded, the Soviet Union would gain Alexander Romanov as its new premier. With Romanov at the helm, there was peace between the Allies and Soviet Union. Romanov used this time to secretly rebuild the Soviet military, which he later used to launch a full-scale invasion of the United States, igniting the Third World War. There were many new vehicles in the Soviets' arsenal during the war, as well as upgraded versions of ones used in the previous war. This included a large double-barreled tank called the Apocalypse Assault Tank.
Soviet power supreme.
The Apocalypse tank was the only double-barreled tank in the Soviets' arsenal at this time, unless you count the 2 Tesla coils the new Tesla tanks were armed with. The coils combined their charge into a single attack though, unlike the gun barrels of the Apocalypse tank, which maintained the 1-2 punch firing method of their predecessor Mammoth and Heavy tanks. The Apocalypse tank had heavy armor, enabling it to take a great amount of damage before succumbing. Its dual 120mm barrels could inflict a serious amount of damage against any enemy armor that would oppose it. The Apocalypse tank retained a crewman who was dedicated to repairing any damage it sustained in combat. The tank also retained anti-air missiles to protect itself from enemy aircraft, though they proved to be especially effective against the Allies' rocket troopers. Unlike the Mammoth tank, the Apocalypse tank seemed to have a plow mine attached to the front of the chassis in order to disable any mines it potentially encountered. The Apocalypse tank did retain the same weaknesses as the Mammoth, such as the vehicle being expensive to build and slow-moving due to its size. Apocalypse tank crews that attained elite veteran status were a true force to be reckoned with. Their anti-air missiles had a faster rate of fire, plus their standard double-barreled guns could fire 4 shots in rapid succession, unlike the standard 2 shots of non-veteran APOC tanks. This was in addition to the shells having increased explosive power to inflict even more damage. There were at least 4 elite Apocalypse tanks that were part of Romanov's Black Guard, a special force assigned to defend the Kremlin and the Premier himself. During the Soviet campaign of events, the Allies recruited Albert Einstein to oversee the development of a new kind of chronosphere, capable of teleporting whole divisions of units nearly anywhere on the planet. Thanks to his intelligence sources, Romanov's advisor Yuri discovered the Allies would use the chronosphere to launch an attack against a research lab located in the Ural Mountains. Yuri believed the goal of this attack would be to steal the blueprints for the Apocalypse tank. An unnamed Soviet commander was assigned to defend the lab from the Allies' assault. He was able to successfully do so, though the Allies proved to be quite tenacious, launching several follow-up attacks. They also used spies to try and infiltrate the lab, though the Soviet general trained plenty of attack dogs to sniff out and eliminate these spies. Eventually, the Allies gave up trying to destroy or infiltrate the lab, thus handing victory to the Soviet commander. Despite their initial surprise attack against the United States, the Soviets would be pushed back by the Allies and would end up losing the Third World War. Conflict would again reignite between the Allies and Soviet Union sometime after the resolution of the Psychic Dominator disaster. In an attempt to avoid another loss, Colonel Anatoly Cherdenko, along with General Krukov and scientist Grigor Zelinsky, would use a newly created time machine hidden beneath the Kremlin to alter the past and change the present. The result of this interference in the space-time continuum was the creation of a new timeline, one where the Soviets were winning the Third World War against the Allies, while also having to contend with a third world power called the Empire of the Rising Sun. Despite this new timeline, Apocalypse tanks remained a signature component of the Soviet Union's military.
Armageddon is here.
The Apocalypse tanks of this alternate timeline were manufactured at the Arkhangelsk tank plant. It featured 2 125mm Drakon cannons, a Shuka magnetic harpoon, Misaruka chain treads, 16-layer reinforced steel armor, and a Tesla reactor to power the entire vehicle, which eliminated 70% of emissions. This monstrosity of a machine, while clearly slower and less maneuverable than the typical modern tank, overcompensates for any of its limitations with 2 extremely powerful main guns, each one markedly stronger than the main gun on a lesser tank. Even amid all the calamities of war, the choking black smoke and piercing shriek of grinding metal emanating from an Apocalypse tank is the stuff of nightmares for combat veterans, including Soviets, who seem to fear the Apocalypse tank as much as anyone. On the whole, the Soviet Union is extremely proud of the Apocalypse tank, which is widely featured in military multimedia propaganda, military recruitment mailings, motivational posters found in businesses and classrooms, and more. The Apocalypse tank even became popularized in a morning cartoon show and toy line, They Are Not Allies, at which point it truly became an icon in the Soviet Union's military arsenal and all over the world. The Apocalypse tank is such a massive vehicle that ATP engineers installed a second set of cutting treads into its massive hull, enabling it to simply roll over just about anything that survives long enough to get in its way. To further offset the tank's relatively slow speed is a now standard magnetic harpoon secondary weapon, one of the first practical military tools based on the Union's continuing research into magnetism. Essentially, this works like an industrial-strength grapple that can be used, for example, to tow fast-moving enemy vehicles in closer for the kill, straight into its meat grinder chain treads, which can carve through metal, much like their namesake. It should be noted that the Apocalypse tank's magnetic harpoon could also be used on structures. Structures were too heavy for the Apocalypse to pull towards it, so instead, the tank would drag itself to the harpoon structure. The same is true for vehicles that were larger than the Apocalypse, such as the Empire's King Oni battle walkers. The M-Harpoon could even be used against naval units like the Allies' destroyer, dragging the vessel toward the shore to be chewed up by the Apocalypse's cutting treads. For all the fervor, fear, and excitement caused by the Apocalypse tank, it is to be expected that the design would draw some disdain. Outspoken critics and foreign protesters of Arhangisk's most famous work, with respect to the far more common hammer tank, point to its horrendous top speed, as well as its complete lack of anti-aircraft defenses, or even a simple anti-infantry machine gun post, as evidence of sheer hubris on the part of the Apocalypse tank's manufacturers. At any rate, because of this tank's notoriety, the identities of Apocalypse tank crews are kept secret by the Soviet Union. It is difficult to imagine what sort of person would be fit to operate such a weapon, let alone what the experience of this would do to that person. While this new iteration of the Apocalypse tank lacked the anti-air capabilities of its predecessors, it did retain the capability to self-repair any damage it sustained in combat. Due to the surprise attack by the Empire of the Rising Sun, the Soviet Union inexplicably found themselves fighting on two fronts. This blow by the Empire was devastating, with the Soviets suffering heavy casualties. This enabled the Allied nations to sweep in and achieve a decisive victory against their old nemesis. After the conflict, the Soviet Union focused on rebuilding its war-torn cities, whose streets were full of vehicle wrecks, rubble, and blast craters, making them difficult to navigate. To clear all this debris, a Georgia-based construction company called Konstruktsiya Karavova created a large road roller called the Grinder.
Who wants to play?
By the time the Union's leaders were brought to justice at Leningrad, the Union had more than enough scrap metal to call its own, as major cities stood lined with vehicle husks and blast craters. The process of literally cleaning up the streets was going to be long, difficult, and expensive. One Georgia-based construction company sought to make the most of this, on the assumption that the sooner the Union's cities and streets could be restored, the sooner the Soviet people could regain their pride and return to a normal way of life. The company's solution was to update its entire fleet of road rollers, once used for laying down asphalt, into street-sweeping super machines that had a resemblance to the iconic Apocalypse tank. They were fitted with toothy, heavy-duty drums and upgraded with powerful engines that could push through anything. The machines were then retrofitted with pontoons from destroyed ore collectors, which would allow the roller vehicles to shove all the Union's trash and debris out into the water in record time. The result was nicknamed the Grinder, and in spite of the supposedly benign nature of the thing, initial attempts to make use of it had catastrophic consequences. Although eyewitness accounts vary, the bottom line is that the operator of one of the Grinder prototypes, unaccustomed to the vehicle's overhauled engine, somehow caused 8 deaths, 37 injuries, and several million rubles worth of additional property damage, while attempting to dump several wrecked hammer tanks into the city's reservoir. This led to the shuttering of the Grinder's manufacturer, though the Grinder itself was saved. Remnant Soviet military forces must have taken an interest in how much destruction it caused in such a short amount of time, as they requisitioned all the prototypes and soon began piecing more of them together, all while denying any intentions of using the vehicles in possible wartime scenarios. It wouldn't be long before the Soviet Union's enemies encountered the Grinder on the battlefield, as the remnants of the Union's military initiated their uprising. Though it lacked conventional weapons, the Grinder could chew through any target in due time. Generally speaking, the bigger the target, the longer it would take to dismantle it. Any victim caught against the Grinder's roller would be unable to move. The only way to free a trapped vehicle would be for another to destroy the Grinder. The Grinder wasn't the fastest vehicle in the Red Army, and as such, enemy vehicle crews exploited this weakness by simply keeping their distance from it. To remedy this, the Grinder was outfitted with an industrial-strength turbocharger, which temporarily increased its top speed, thus allowing the Grinder to quickly catch up to enemy units. One aspect of the Grinder that the turbocharge was unable to remedy, however, was its wide turning radius, giving smaller vehicles the opportunity to outmaneuver the Grinder. The Grinder incorporated spare parts from Soviet ore collectors, particularly their pontoons, which granted the tank its amphibious capabilities. This is believed to be the least accidental aspect of the Grinder's design, the Soviets knowing they needed a heavily armored combat vehicle that could breach out into contested waters and clear a path for expansion forces. The Grinder played a valuable role in supporting the Soviet army during their attack against the headquarters of FutureTech, a defense contractor responsible for providing the Allied nations with many of their advanced weapon systems. This assault resulted in the destruction of FutureTech's Sigma Harmonizer, a device that could literally stop time, albeit temporarily. If such a device had been perfected, FutureTech would have used it to wipe out the Soviet Union for good, and perhaps even asserted control over the Allies and Empire of the Rising Sun. Though losing the Sigma Harmonizer was a major blow to FutureTech, this did not stop them from interfering in the affairs of the three world powers. This interference manifested itself in the form of a newly hired commander, who was tasked with acquiring weapons and technology from the three world powers' top commanders in order to fuel FutureTech's own agenda. The FutureTech commander often went up against Soviet General Oleg Vodnik, who specialized in armored warfare. The two first met in Niger, where Oleg was trying, and failing, to improve upon the Soviets' infamous Apocalypse tank. Many of these apocalypses would be sent against Oleg's nemesis, but the FutureTech commander would prevail, sending Oleg retreating back to Russia. The FutureTech commander was able to secure intact Apocalypse tanks for his employer, who gave the commander the capability to manufacture the Apocalypses as part of his Soviet arsenal. The FutureTech commander and Oleg would come to blows again later, this time in India, though it should be noted the map itself looks more like it takes place somewhere in the Soviet Union, perhaps Georgia, since that's where the Grinder tank originated. And that's exactly why Oleg was here, putting the Grinders through their paces. Though a body of water separated both commanders' bases, the Grinders were able to easily traverse across the water to attack the FutureTech base. The FutureTech commander overcame these challenges, defeating Oleg once again, and adding the Grinder tank to his ever-expanding arsenal of military assets. While the Allies may go down in history for their dominant air force, and the Empire for their magnificent battle walkers, the Soviet Union will be remembered for creating the most destructive tanks. From the mad tanks of the Second World War to the Grinders of the Third War. And while the Apocalypse tanks may not have literally lived up to their namesake, their sight on the battlefield cast a deadly shadow over the enemies of the Soviet Union.